Today is January 7th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Last Monday, or I should say this past Monday, on Monday Night Football, a player named Damar Hamlin, I'm pretty sure that's his name, collapsed on the field and had a heart attack. I wasn't watching the game. I really don't watch much sports at this point in my life, but I saw the news start to come across social media over the course of the evening, and I checked out to see what had happened. And this NFL pro football player was hit in the chest by the helmet of an opponent, and it's believed, or it was suggested, that the impact from that helmet in his chest actually caused him to have a heart attack, and he collapsed on the ground, and the first responders rushed onto the field and performed CPR as they're trained to do, and they were able to help him enough until the ambulance could get him to the local hospital in Cincinnati, and he spent a couple of days in critical condition, sedated, and then I think it was Thursday evening, he started to show signs of improvement, and then yesterday, Friday, he was talking again and was breathing on his own, and it was this great story that I think a lot of Americans needed. We always say that sometimes we become so complacent, so comfortable as Americans that we just take everything for granted and begin acting like fools. And this event was just sort of a wake-up call to millions of people. This pro football player, Damar Hamlin, who had a heart attack on the field. Now, what I'd like to talk about is what happened after this event took place on the field. The event was terrifying to see. There were clips posted all over social media because when the event took place, no one knew what was actually going on. They thought he just maybe had a concussion or who knows what, because there are times where players pass out or have trouble on the field, but it wasn't until a little while later that news started to go around that he might be dead, actually, that he might have died, and so a lot of those videos were taken down. But immediately, all across social media, all over the news, there were requests for prayer for this young man. And there are jokes on social media because a few years ago, remember when Tim Tebow was playing? He was a religious football player. He used to pray before the games, and throughout the games he would take a knee and pray, and the Pro Football League was sort of offended by this visual, and they tend to discourage displays of religious beliefs on the field during games. So there were jokes on social media saying, all of a sudden the NFL seems to be okay with prayers on the field. And so there were requests, like I said, for prayers, and then it turned out that it was learned that this football player had a GoFundMe page where he was raising some cash to help poor children get some Christmas presents and things like that. He's not a wealthy football player. He's not a star or anything like that. So he had a GoFundMe page where he was trying to collect $2,500 to buy some toys for children during the holidays, and word got around that he had this GoFundMe page set up, and people started sharing the news of that GoFundMe page and making donations, and within a couple days, the last time I noticed it, it had received over $7 million in donations. And so from requests for prayers, prayers even on television, on sports news stations, the newscasters praying on public television, which is extremely uncommon. There was this sort of sense that maybe Americans don't want to be irreligious after all. Maybe Americans really would rather live by faith and love each other. It was a very interesting week of events to watch as it all unfolded, and thanks be to God, this young man is supposedly doing better. But in the midst of all of that religious talk, in the midst of all of that well-wishing and generosity and these requests and pledges of prayers, and you always have the thoughts and prayer thing, I noticed another man who was posting on social media. I can't repeat his language because it was profane, but he was basically arguing, nonsense with these prayers. Forget these prayers. That wasn't his language. You can imagine it was much more foul than that. But, forget these prayers. Those emergency workers, those first responders, they saved his life. These doctors, that hospital, this medical technology, those nurses, they saved his life. And so he was cursing all of this talk about religion and God and prayers, and arguing that it was the first responders and the nurses and the doctors and the medical technology and the medical equipment at the hospital and so on that saved his life, and this talk of religion is just stupid. And I remember reading that in the midst of all of this religious talk, and I realized that that man was revealing an important point, and it was that point he was making that I wanted to talk about. And I spent some time today just reflecting on it more, and I felt like the more I reflected on it, the deeper the reflection became, and I figured I would share what I was thinking about, because I think it can really help us Christians in the 21st century. Because for all of the arrogant talk of Christians, for all of the confident talk, for all of the mocking of the world and unbelievers, Christians in the 21st century are extremely ignorant of religion and philosophy, and they're extremely insecure. There are very few Christians who can reconcile the Christian faith and life in the modern world. There are very few Christians who can have a coherent worldview that takes into consideration ancient religion and modern information and technology. And that man, his criticism of religion, I think, reveals an important thing, an important problem in modern Christianity that we as Christians have to focus on and eliminate. And I'd like to talk about it a little bit. So, a man collapses and is in danger of losing his life. There are two responses. One is first responders rush to the scene and beginning performing mechanical actions to resuscitate this man. If you don't understand how CPR works, if you've never had CPR training, it's a very simple concept. It's an amazing concept. I remember the first time I received CPR training, I couldn't believe how obvious it was, and yet without that training, I don't think we would normally think of doing something like that in an emergency. But the whole concept is that when a person's heart stops beating, when a person loses consciousness, if their blood is not circulating, then oxygen is no longer moving through their body, and if oxygen doesn't get to their brain, they'll die. And so the goal of CPR is to literally and simply, I mean, it's this simple, to blow air into the person's lungs and then compress the chest to force the heart, to use it like a manual pump to physically pump the blood through the circulatory system in the person's body so that the air in his lungs can get into his bloodstream and be moved through his body. Now, a person obviously can't live like that, and it's not sufficient oxygen for life, but it's enough oxygen by blowing into the person's lungs and then compressing the heart and using the heart as a pump to pump the blood through the circulatory system. It's enough oxygen to sometimes resuscitate the person, but in the case that the person can't be resuscitated at that time, to simply keep some oxygen moving through the person's body until the EMT workers, the paramedics can get there and they can get him into a hospital where they have all of their resources to help him. So it's an emergency procedure that simply tries to minimize the effects of whatever the tragedy is that takes place. That was the response of those first responders, who are heroic people. And so you have that response, this mechanical, human, physical response from some people, and then you have this call to prayer from other people. And we see this division between prayer and human action. Prayer and human action. Now, what's happened in modern American society is that many Christians who have not studied philosophy, do not study anatomy or medicine, don't understand these subjects. What they often do is they lazily turn to religion as sort of a cure-all for every problem, and they act as if they're just going to pray. They'll say things like, we're just going to trust God. We don't have health insurance. We don't take any medicine. We don't go to the doctors. We just trust God. We're going to pray. And that sounds great when everyone is healthy. But then whenever there's an emergency, the next thing you know, the ambulance is there, the EMTs are there, the paramedics are there, and the person is whisked away to a hospital. And so modern Christianity in many places takes this anti-science, anti-medicine, anti-technology position and sort of plants the Christian flag in this, I don't want to call it spiritual, but sort of a pseudo-spiritual or maybe even hyper-spiritual position, and sets it up in opposition to the medical and science community, the emergency responders, and things like that. And they set it up like, we trust in the Lord. God is in control of our life. If the Lord wants me to die, then I'll die. If the Lord wants me to live, then I'll live. This hyper-religious attitude towards human life which again, as I said, in most cases isn't actually practiced when the tragedies occur. They immediately just leap into the medical care system. And I guess you could say, well, I didn't want to. But the Christians create this division on one side. They choose to set religion and science at odds with each other. On the opposite extreme, you have the atheistic, agnostic anti-Christians who create the same division. They set mechanical, human responses up as an alternative to religious responses, like praying or calling for a priest to anoint the sick, things like that. They'll set up an entirely materialistic response to a tragedy as the right way, and they will mock all religious activity. And that's the position of the man who I mentioned, writing on social media, cursing the religious talk and saying, no, those EMT workers, those nurses, those doctors, they saved that man. And we've got this division in society between these two extremes, the atheists on one side, or at least agnostics on one side, who claim to be scientific and think only of material causes in any sort of human tragedy. And then on the opposite extreme, you've got these hyper-religious Christians who deny that we have any need for any technology or medicine or human responses. We can just pray and trust in God. And these two opposite extremes fight with each other, and they cause something to come about that's destructive and dangerous. And what it is that they cause to come about is this division and this irrational confusion about how we should handle these things in life, how we should handle our physical health, how we should handle some kind of physical emergency, how we should handle a sickness, a disease, an accident, a death, whatever. They almost challenge people to pick one side or the other. And the problem with this is that both of them are based on false understanding of the philosophical answer to this dilemma. This is a false dilemma. This division between human effort and reliance on divine providence is a false dilemma. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit because this is something that I've actually studied recently in my own philosophical studies, so it's sort of fresh in my mind, and I feel like it's pretty clear and might be helpful. If we look through history, what we see is that religion often leaves men in these false dilemmas. In the ancient world, we have philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism. We have people talking about fate and destiny, these religious topics, because these are all lazy products of our own thoughts when we don't have the light of divine revelation to guide us, or a persevering pursuit of the truth that gets beyond superficial opinions and, off the hip responses. And I'll explain that a little bit. For example, Epicureanism, which was a popular philosophy back in ancient Greece and Rome, Epicureanism taught that everything has a material cause. One of the key lines in Epicurean teaching is that nothing comes from nothing. Nothing comes from nothing. That everything has a material cause. And they mocked the idea of any kind of religion. because they said if this religion was true, if religious belief was true, and there were gods and goddesses or even a god or spirits, then random stuff could just happen at any time, in any place, anywhere. And so the Epicureans in the ancient world thought like the modern atheists and agnostics. In fact, I would say that scientific agnosticism or atheism is just a disguise for Epicureanism. On the other side, you had the Stoics, and the Stoics took a different approach. The Stoics said, if we would simply discipline ourselves to not set our affections or expectations on anything that's not in our control, we simply wouldn't care when tragic events take place, because they're just natural. And so the Stoics had a pantheistic view of the world where God and the universe were one, and everything that happened was simply what God willed, and it's basically none of our business. And so the Stoic has to train himself to detach himself from everything that takes place and accept everything as God's will, and have no desire or have no expectation for anything that's out of his control to begin with. And so there's this Stoic indifference to things. That's a different approach to handling things like this, to just sort of treat it with sort of a Buddhist attitude, just to accept it and roll with it and, just take the next step and move on and forget what just happened. That's the Stoic response. And then, again, in the ancient world, you had true religious teachers and believers. You had the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Christians throughout the early church and into medieval times, who actually maintained a careful balance between the physical and the spiritual worlds, and had a system of faith and philosophy that reconciled them all and actually taught the truth. I would argue that this is what we find in scholasticism. We find a reconciled worldview, a coherent worldview that takes into consideration both the physical world and the spiritual world, both the body and the soul. And that's, in my opinion, why scholasticism is so important. We don't simply say, the body doesn't matter, this life doesn't matter, all that matters is our soul. That's not true. Our body is the most valuable thing in this world. It's extremely valuable. It's created by God. It's impossibly complex and incredible in its design and its functions. There's nothing more valuable than the human body in this entire physical universe. And yet at the same time, it's joined to a soul which is eternal and is made in the image of God with reason and understanding. For a philosophy, for human philosophy and wisdom to be true, it has to take into consideration both of these realms, as it were. It has to be true in the physical realm and in the spiritual realm. It has to reconcile them both. It has to unite and explain them both, or it's simply false. And as Aristotle taught, there's a million ways to get it wrong, but there's only one way to get the truth. These things have to be reconciled, and that takes an incredible amount of study and reflection. We have to study the natural world. We have to study ourselves. We have to study moral philosophy, natural philosophy, rational philosophy, metaphysics. We have to study theology. We have to study divine revelation in sacred scripture. We have to study all of these things to develop a coherent and perfect worldview. And especially in today's society, there are very, very few people who are making an effort to do that. And I'm not saying that I am one and everyone else is stupid. I've been seeking this for 25 years now, And I still am conscious of the reality that I know nothing relative to what was known by men like Thomas Aquinas in past centuries. There were men who walked this earth whose wisdom and understanding of this life was incomprehensible to most of us today. We've been trained in modern schools to think that anybody who lived before the scientific revolution was superstitious and, ignorant. But I challenge you, and I challenge anyone who imagines himself to be some sort of scientist or free thinker to study the Summa Theologica or the Summa Contra Gentiles of St. Thomas Aquinas and explain it to us. Show us how simple and ignorant and superstitious those men were. What we'll find is that what's taught in those works is many times more profound and complex and accurate in explaining both physical and spiritual realities than anything we find in any modern science or research. So there's this chronological snobbery, this arrogance towards things of the past in many modern scientific circles that, combined with an almost spitefully ignorant and lazy, hyper-religious worldview, I guess I can say, that creates this false dilemma. And the truth lies between these two false extremes. And what we see when tragedies take place is this false dilemma exposed. It becomes very visible. We have sort of the crazy Christians on one side who are just sitting there and praying. And then we have these materialists who just sort of get to work on the body, get to work checking the vital signs, trying to figure out what's wrong with the body, trying to figure out what material remedy can be applied to try and eliminate or at least mask some material cause that's having a negative effect on the body to try to save the physical life. And it doesn't think beyond that. And we have these two extremes sort of standing next to each other, unable to communicate, unable to think alike, having nothing in common. And this is a modern dilemma that's caused by, as I said, false scientific thinking, but also false religious thinking. So what's the real problem here? What's the problem here? The problem is that for many religious people in modern society, they don't have philosophical education. That wouldn't be a problem if they lived like peasants in the medieval world and just minded their own business. But because of the internet and information technology and television and all of the idle conversation that takes place, modern religious people, especially under the influence of the Protestant Reformation, they believe that because they read the Bible a little bit and because they're Christians, they have some kind of profound understanding of all things. And they feel free commenting on any subject, even if they've never given any attention to it in any kind of formal study or research or even meditation. They just shoot from the hip, as I said before, and talk about things, and it becomes their religion. They commit to it as religious doctrine, and they begin to imagine that anytime they question these opinions they have, it's a problem of doubting the faith, because they identify their opinions as the faith. And this is where things get really wacky. And this is where this false dilemma comes from. What they end up falling into, these hyper-religious people, they end up falling into a fatalistic worldview where they think almost like Stoics that everything is simply ordained by God and therefore we don't need to worry about anything. We quote passages like Romans 8 and just say, well, all things work for the good of those who love God. So, you know, God's got the whole world in his hand. Everything is fine. So let's just pray and move on. And they present this as some kind of faithful, devout, religious thinking, when in fact it's irresponsible and contrary to God's commandments. And so we have this false dilemma in our society, and it's primarily caused by this lazy, oversimplified, fatalistic Christian teaching that just sort of sees everything as in God's control, and everything sort of unfolds as God intends for it to do. And so if something happens, what should you do? You should pray, because the only person who can change anything is God. God caused this thing, or at least allowed this thing to happen, and the only way to have any effect is to simply ask God to turn it off or change it. And that's the mindset that develops. And of course, that's not a mindset ever held by saints or doctors of the church. Certainly not taught by Christ, not taught in the scriptures. It's a lazy, modern, post-Protestant, individualistic, democratic, me and my Bible response to real-world questions and problems. Now, what philosophy teaches us, true philosophy, it teaches us that while God knows all things, God knows the past, the present, and the future as if it was all one. There's no time with God. God is eternal. He's outside of time. He simply doesn't see things or experience things the way that we do. He sees the whole parade, as it were, whereas we're standing on the side of the road watching one part of the parade as it moves past us. We have a past, that part of the parade that has already gone by. We have a present, that part of the parade which is in front of us at the moment. And then we have a future, which is that part of the parade which hasn't yet moved past us. God sees the whole parade. There is no future, present, or past with God. He's infinite. He's eternal. He knows all things. Now, what happens is when we begin talking, again, lazily, superficially, about things like God's infinity, God's eternity, God's omniscience, that he knows all things, what happens is people think that they can just run with these ideas and start applying them, without really understanding the complexity of these ideas, of these concepts. So when we begin to say that God knows all things and there's no future, present, or past with God, people begin to suggest that God already knew what was going to happen, that God intended what was going to happen, that God is sovereign, and God maybe even predestined this to happen, or if something happens, God willed it to happen. And we can see that this shallow knowledge of a concept like God's omniscience leads to fatalistic thinking. And you can imagine that when you think about things like that and something happens, like let's say there's a car crash and you're standing by the side of the road and an accident takes place, that religious mindset leads you to think, well, I guess I should pray, because that's really the only thing that I can do. I mean, after all, God knew that this crash was going to happen. God already knows if these people are going to live or die. These things are all in God's control. He's omniscient. He controls the whole world. So, all I can do is just pray, because, God is going to determine what happens here, one way or the other. And that's where this superficial thinking leads us, to this hyper-religious, ignorant, as I say, hyper-religion, where we just can't really think of anything other than a religious response to any problem that we see in the world. Now, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that when we get into questions of God's knowledge of all things, we can say that God has ordained all things. But that doesn't mean that things happen because of some kind of fate, that they must necessarily happen. What Aristotle teaches in his works on reasoning is that the future is, for the most part, in almost all circumstances, the future in God's will is contingent. The future in God's will, that God has actually willed it to be so, the future is contingent. And what that means is that what happens in the future is not, or does not happen necessarily. It doesn't happen by some kind of fate. God leaves human beings free to act and make decisions, and their decisions and actions actually determine what happens in future events. The future events are contingent. That's what it means to be contingent. Contingent is the opposite of necessary. Okay? So future events are not known by God in some kind of way that causes them to be necessary or makes us subjects of fate, as the ancient Greeks struggled to think. But the future is left to human freedom and is contingent. Even though God remains in control of all things, he allows it to be worked out in a contingent way where the actions of men and women actually determine the outcomes of these future events. To give an illustration of this, and remember, this is just an illustration. Let's say I'm a father and I'm watching my son in the yard, and I can give you an example. Once one of my sons got to the age where he could start mowing the lawn, so he took over for his older brother. And we've got a fast zero-turn mower that we use on the property, and I told him, this thing really isn't a toy. You have to be careful. Don't go fast. Take your time and go slow, because this thing really can move, and you can lose control of it and get into trouble. And so he got started, and I showed him what to do, and he had seen his brothers use it before, so he was getting started and starting to cut, and then I left him alone, and then maybe 15 minutes later or so, I took a peek to see how he was doing, and there he is, just flying around full speed. And there were two options for me at that point. I could have immediately run out and stopped him and caused him to be safe, or I could simply remain there and watch and see what happens and leave the result to his decisions and actions. That's what contingency means. So I'm in control of the situation. I'm watching. I know what can happen. I know what the dangers are. But I'm going to let the event be determined by the decision that my son makes, because if he makes a bad decision, he's going to learn a lesson, and I want him to learn that lesson, because I'm concerned with more than just getting the grass cut today. I also would like him to learn to be responsible, to listen when he's warned about things, and I'd like him to be able to cut the grass safely for the future. So there's more to this whole management of this event, in my mind as the father, than just getting the grass cut, or even keeping my son safe. And so I allowed him to just keep zipping around, and finally he clipped a stump that was in the grass and busted up the lawnmower, and was upset and humiliated, because as soon as it happened, he knew why it happened, and he had to learn the lesson that when I told him not to zip around, I wasn't just making things up. I wasn't just stupid. And he doesn't need to consider that. I was telling him because it was likely that he was going to hit something. And I have experience cutting the grass, and I know that there are all kinds of unseen things that you can catch when you're flying around. And I wanted to prevent him from doing that, but I left it to his free choice and action so that he could learn a lesson, and we could deal with a number of different problems in this situation. So you can see that there's a value in leaving future events contingent so that the decisions and actions made by the free individual can lead to some higher ends or higher goals in certain situations. And God, in governing the world, controls the future in this way. He leaves us in our freedom to do things, and our choices and actions can actually bring about effects that would not have come about if we had not acted in that way. We actually control future events, and we control future events and can control outcomes of different circumstances by our decisions and actions, and it's God's will that the future be determined through contingent events. Why am I talking about this? When we come to practical problems, like a person having a heart attack and collapsing on the field, we control the outcome of that event by God's will. The outcome of that event was contingent upon human action. That 24-year-old football player collapsed on the field, and if people would have stood there and simply prayed for him, he likely would have died, because that response is not God's will. That response is not natural, it's not rational, it's not charitable. It's actually the result of false religious thinking that would think to pray rather than actually try to physically save that man's life. That event was contingent. The outcome of that event was a contingent future event. If the EMT workers weren't there and quickly got down on the ground with that man and performed CPR to keep his blood flowing, we can't think that he would have lived if they didn't do that. If the hospital wasn't nearby, if an ambulance wasn't available, if they couldn't get him into a hospital where they could control his breathing and oxygen levels and monitor his vital signs and things like that and care for him the way they do, if that wasn't available to him, the contingent future event would likely not have been what it is. And none of this is contrary to God's will or contrary to religion. This is all within human reason and power. And as Christians, we have to reconcile these things, because our hyper-religious response to world problems and issues in our lives is causing contingent future events to turn out in ways that they shouldn't turn out. For example, let's just take a couple issues in modern Christian life. There are no vocations in the church today, and so what does the church do? We pray for vocations. Now, is that a reasonable response? Well, if you think that vocations arise magically because God simply, sprinkles some fairy dust on individuals and they become monks or nuns or priests, well then yes, then the only thing that we can do is pray. But if we look back at history, if we look at the lives of the saints, if we look back at the monasteries and convents and seminaries that were filled throughout history, and we ask, why were they filled? We'll find that the Christians who lived in those past generations didn't think that religious vocations are simply a matter that's determined by fate and therefore can only be pursued by prayer. They built and ran schools because they knew that children needed to be taught and trained to know God and to serve God and love God, and that they needed to have habits of prayer and daily discipline and worship taught to them and drilled in their lives by repetition. And so the church in past generations understood religious vocations to be a contingent future event that we have a part to play in. And therefore there is a natural, a rational, human work that needs to be done in order to make it more likely that the outcome will be what we desire it to be, because it's left to contingency. It's left for us to try and bring about it as far as is in our power. We're to work for it. The salvation of the world was not accomplished, or is not being accomplished to this day, by God simply, flicking invisible switches on in people's souls and causing people to randomly start believing. God established the church and commanded the church to go into the world and preach the gospel. Why? Because the salvation of men is contingent. It's contingent upon preaching. Paul said, how can they believe in him whom they do not know? How can they know him unless there is a preacher? Unless the gospel is preached, how can anyone believe? Believing is a contingent event that depends on preaching. And therefore, if you want people to believe, you have to preach. St. James also talked about men who see neighbors who have no food and clothing, and they just sort of pray for them and wish them well. They say, may God give you food and clothing, as if that's a reasonable response to the physical present needs that they see in their neighbor. Their neighbors being fed and clothed is a contingent future event, contingent upon the Christian giving the person food and clothing. Responding with a prayer is not rational. It's not even spiritual. It's not charitable. It's not obedient to what God's commandments and Christ's way actually taught and showed us. When our Lord and the disciples stood before the crowd of 5,000, and they had no food because they had followed Jesus for the day, they had nothing to eat, what does Jesus say to his disciples? He says, give them something to eat. And in that situation, the apostles said, what can we possibly do here? Like, there's 5,000 people, and we're penniless disciples following you around, learning your teaching and ministering to you. How can we possibly feed 5,000 people? And the scriptures tell us that Jesus already knew in that situation what he was going to do. And what's the response? The response is, we have no food to give to these people. But to give them nothing would be inexcusable. We want them to eat. We don't have food. What can we do? The apostles did not pray, because that would have been an unreasonable response. What the apostles did was take whatever food that they could find and offer it to remedy the problem. And it was Christ who took the food and by means of a divine miracle multiplied the bread and the fishes and fed the people. But there was the feeding of the 5,000 was a contingent future event, and putting the bread and the fish on the table was a part of the solution of that problem. The scriptures did not teach us that what we should do in a situation like that is pray. When we go to Mass every Sunday or even every day, we go to Mass and we celebrate the sacrifice of our Lord for the redemption of the world. We don't go there and simply pray. In order for the world to be saved, Christ needed to come into the world as a man in flesh and blood and offer his physical life for the salvation of the world. And this sacrifice is continued on the altar at Mass every time the priest offers Mass. And yet we don't simply show up and pray. The priest doesn't simply show up and pray. And let me say this, Jesus doesn't simply show up when we pray. In the Mass, we bring bread and wine and put them on the altar. The church provides bread and wine, and then a miracle occurs, and God causes the bread and wine to be changed into the substance of the body and the blood of Christ. The redemption of the world is contingent upon human action. Some people say things like, if there are no priests, then there's no Eucharist. Well, if there's no bread and wine, there's also no Eucharist. If there's no water, there's no baptism. These things aren't simply spiritual events for the hyper-religious. These are also physical events that are contingent upon human actions. And this is what's so beautiful about Catholicism, is that it reconciles the physical world and the spiritual world. It explains both of them. It brings them together and actually explains for us how human beings, body and soul, can live and be happy and have eternal glory. This is what makes Catholicism the only true religion. It's the only religion that addresses the physical and the spiritual, that brings them together and makes sense out of everything and redeems them all, redeems our physical things. It's not just spiritual talk or thoughts and prayers. It's also deliberate actions and choices of human beings to do the right thing in a circumstance where the future events or the outcomes are contingent upon human action. Many Christians don't think like this. They separate themselves from material causes of things. They separate themselves from human responsibility in different things, and they pretend that by not putting their hands into the work, not putting their money on the table, not putting their time into the activity, not actually serving the need with their own physical resources, but simply stepping back and offering thoughts and prayers, that they're being religious. But there's no religion, certainly not the Christian religion, teaching any such thing. Now what happens is that this shallow, fake, hyper-spiritual religion is repugnant to people who err on the side of materialism, and they despise this religion. And these two sides, instead of working together, or I should say, instead of each side
being deficient, seeking to be made perfect by reconciling with the other side and finding something of a golden mean. The two sides choose instead to spite each other and fight against each other. And that's what we see in modern society. We see this materialistic, agnostic, quote-unquote, scientific community on one side, and we see this lazy, superficial, and I'll say hypocritical religious camp on the other side, and they spend all of their time accusing each other of being the problem when both of them are actually wrong. The challenge that we have as Christians, and this is what's wrong with Christianity in the modern world, is that it has ceased to be active. It has ceased to be incarnate. It's becoming more and more idle spiritual talk. It's becoming more and more thoughts and prayers. And the Christians leave the physical actions and reactions and responses. The Christians leave the works to the unbelievers, to other people to take care of, and they criticize them as they undertake those works, because they don't undertake them in a quote-unquote spiritual way. So where are the Catholic kids going to school? Are they going to school in Catholic schools being organized and run by the Catholic laity? Because they understand that the children's future lives are filled with contingencies that are in their control to effect while these children are growing up in the parish. Are the laymen working to organize and staff and run and support Catholic schools for the children? Or are they simply throwing thoughts and prayers at their children's education while the children go off to schools that aren't even Catholic? You see the division. You see the division where we find Catholics criticizing the public schools because the public schools don't read the Bible and they don't pray and they don't promote and enforce Christian morals. The people actually working in the public school, the administrators, the teachers, the coaches, all of the different staff members, they're expected to do the work of the school. The Christians stand outside as if they're there to judge the school, as if it's somebody else's job to actually do the work of the school, and they're going to evaluate it as they pray for the children. You see the problem that exists in modern Catholicism, and I would argue in the laity in modern Catholicism. These are the duties of the laity. This is what the laity's for. If you're not a priest or a monk or a nun, this is what you're supposed to be doing in the world. You're supposed to be directing temporal affairs according to the will of God. You're supposed to be trying to cause contingent future events to turn out as well as possible. Not simply watching things unfold and saying, aha, look at these filthy public schools. Now they've got transgender teachers. Now they've got drag queens reading books in the library. Look at these, these dumpster fire schools that, well, if the Christians all withdraw from the institutions, what is the actual cause of the failure of these institutions? Is it not that the decisions and actions of the Christians are causing these future contingent events to be what they are? If the Christians withdraw and leave everything to non-Christians, what's the actual cause of that thing becoming anti-Christian in character? Is it not the withdrawal of the Christians? So who is the actual cause of the problems and the crises that exist in the public schools or in the Catholic schools? If the Catholic laymen withdraw from the work
and it collapses. And they point to the bishop and they say, well, look, the bishop shut down the school. Who is the actual cause of the school closing? Is it the bishop who simply announced what was necessary, that the school cannot function? Or was it the laity that didn't do the work, that chose to stand there and watch the thing burn down and pray that God would put the fire out, instead of throwing water on it and trying to save it? This is why this false religious idea that doesn't understand that God has willed that these events be contingent upon human actions. And why? Because when these events are dependent on human actions, every problem becomes a means of reward, meriting reward, or proving ourselves guilty and deserving of punishment. So if there's a problem in front of us, and we have the means, and we choose to not actually employ or exhaust our means to solve that problem, but instead we flip into this irrational thoughts and prayers religion and say, well, I'll just pray for this thing. We've chosen not to do good, and we deserve to be punished for not doing the good that was within our power. On the contrary, if we see a problem and we choose to do good, we merit the reward. We're responsible for that future contingent event turning out good as it does. Because when the problem arose, we employed the means available to us. We sacrificed the resources that were necessary, whatever they were, our time, our energy, our strength, our health, whatever. We sacrificed to bring about a good event, because that good was contingent upon someone getting involved and actually doing something. Now, what's happening because of this in modern society is that the atheists and the agnostics are doing the physical work, and the Christians are sending thoughts and prayers. When this young man, this 24-year-old man, wakes up as he has done and begins to recover, he's going to be surrounded by two different groups of people. He's going to be surrounded by religious people who sent thoughts and prayers, and he's going to be surrounded by EMT workers who physically kept his blood moving and kept oxygen in his lungs while he was laying on the field. He's going to be with nurses who constantly attended to him while he was unconscious, making sure his vital signs were looking good and everything was okay, that his condition was stable. He's going to be looking at doctors who physically cared for the physical functions of his body. And he's going to see that those people physically saved his life. And if we had one of those two groups, the people who sent their thoughts and prayers, or the people who physically rescued him, and we had to choose one, which one was more important? If you say, well, I think the people who prayed and sent thoughts and prayers were more important, you're simply not realistic, because it's not God's will. In the story of the Good Samaritan, when the man was found who had been robbed and was beaten, did the Good Samaritan pray for him? Or did the Good Samaritan pick the man up, put him on his donkey, bring him to an inn, and pay for all of his needs, that someone might take care of him and help him to recover his health? What does God actually teach us? Does he teach us to send thoughts and prayers, or does he teach us to actually physically help our neighbor with whatever resources are in our control? The truth is very, very plain. Which one of the two was more like the Good Samaritan? I don't remember the Good Samaritan saying one word of prayer. He simply did good, and his act was religious because it was right. Which of the two, the religious or the agnostics, in this tragedy, in this man's life, which of the two was more like the Good Samaritan, whom Jesus presented to us as a model of charity? Which of the two? Those who are religious, talking about God and sending thoughts and prayers, or the doctors and first responders and nurses who physically worked and employed every means within their power and knowledge to try to physically save his life? This is the problem in modern society. It's the agnostics, it's the atheists, who in most cases are doing the work of the Good Samaritan. And people know that. And that's why they're respected and honored, and they should be. And this is also why the religious people are disrespected and dishonored, and they should be, because what they're doing in the name of religion is not what their religion teaches. This false dilemma is what's actually causing the world to grow in influence and take over everything, and what is also causing Christianity to decline and be considered to be useless by most people, especially the younger generations. They see it as useless. If one of our kids crashes a car on the highway, who's going to save him? The Christians or the police and firemen and EMT workers and hospital staff? And when that child gets older and gets into trouble at a later point in life, who is he going to turn to? Is he going to turn to religion, or is he going to turn to the agnostics? He shouldn't have to make that choice. He shouldn't have to make that choice. Now, if we look into those situations more carefully, and this is what I actually responded to that man who was cursing religion, if we look into the situation more carefully, what we find is that many of those first responders and doctors and emergency workers are Christians. And they're motivated in their work by their Christian faith. But they often keep it under a lampstand, under a bushel basket, as Jesus teaches. They don't talk about it. They conceal it because their religious faith, they don't have a religious faith that they can articulate and reconcile with the work that they do. And that's really unfortunate because the work that they do is good. And the religion that they've learned, even though it's true religion, it's a silly religion. It's a childish religion, not a childlike religion that Jesus recommends to us. It's a foolish and silly religion that can't explain anything. And it's possible for us to have that kind of a religion because it's possible, as St. Thomas teaches, it's possible for us to love God before we know Him. You can look that up in the Summa if you don't believe that St. Thomas teaches that. But we can love God before we know Him. We can love Him before we know Him perfectly, I should say. And that's why it's possible to have true religious faith, true Christian faith, and yet have that faith in a silly religion that the people doing the good works can't reconcile with their good works. And this is really where Catholicism should shine. But what we find is that often the modern clergy have become silly as well. And when they talk about the faith, they talk about it with all of the silly, shallow cliches. And there's no depth, no practicality, no real-world integration, no incarnate religion. being taught. It's silly. And this is what our younger generation struggles with. Religion just seems silly. It doesn't seem real. And yet many of the workers doing the good works are religious people. But the religion that they have is a silly religion that they can't reconcile with their good works. And that's really unfortunate. Because those people doing the work are the people who are closest to true religion. And yet, they may be Protestants, they may be, nominal Catholics, they may be maybe not even Christians, they may be Jews or Muslims, and they have sort of a vague religious sense that's disconnected from the actual good work that they do. And the goal that Christians need to have, that we need to have as laymen, is to get rid of this false dilemma and reconcile these two things by studying philosophy, by learning to understand how the spiritual and the material go together and exist in harmony and can be spoken of in a mature and straightforward way without silly religious talk that everyone feels uncomfortable with in adult situations, which is why no one talks about religion at work, and not allowing the workplace to become this atheist, materialistic, agnostic environment when half the people there working are Christians. And we saw that this week when this man was injured. We saw sportscasters who never say a word about religion all of a sudden manifesting a deep religious spirit, even praying on television. Dan Orlovsky, who's a commentator on ESPN, a retired pro quarterback, prayed for this man on the sports news channel. This religious spirit is present, but it's hidden under a bushel basket because the religious doctrine is too shallow and silly, and there's no study of philosophy. This is what we've produced in modern society, and we need to eliminate this false dilemma and be able to articulate our faith and philosophical convictions in a reasonable and mature way so this dilemma no longer exists. And we're seeing some people do that this week. We're seeing some people who are more articulate, who are more thoughtful, but who have hidden their faith under a basket because of this agnostic, materialistic workplace that's common in America today. So I want to stop here. That's a long talk, but I hope that's helpful. And my recommendation is to try to eliminate this dilemma is to study science, to study philosophy, to study theology, to study sacred scripture, and constantly work to weave them all together and understand how they all can be reconciled. Because when we find that place where they all are reconciled, that place is true religion. And we're going to find that that place is Catholicism. I hope that's helpful. God bless.